Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we journey through the complete lore of Skyrim's civil war. The broken treaty, the murdered king, and the divided province that bled for a freedom it never fully won. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and let me know what worlds you'd like to wander through next. Now settle in, close your eyes if you like, and let the old grievances of a fractured kingdom come back to you, the seeds of war. To understand why Nords and Imperials turned their swords on one another in the snow-choked province of Skyrim, you have to go back decades before the first Stormcloak ever raised a banner. You have to go back to a war that Skyrim never wanted, fought against an enemy Skyrim never chose, ending in a peace that humiliated everyone who survived it. This is the Great War, and it is the wound from which everything else bleeds. The Aldmeri Dominion, the Altmer-led empire centered in Alinor, had spent years building toward a confrontation with the Third Empire of Tamriel. Their goals were not subtle once you read the histories scattered through Skyrim's libraries and the Thalmor embassy's own propaganda. The Dominion viewed the worship of Talos, the deified mortal Tiber Septim, who unified Tamriel into the Empire centuries earlier, as a kind of theological lie, a corruption of the divine order they believed only the Aldmer were fit to interpret. To the Thalmor, Talos worship was not simply a religious difference. It was an insult to the natural hierarchy they believed governed Mundus, and ending it became one of their core war aims before the first blade was drawn. The war itself began in 4E, 171, when the Thalmor invaded Cyrodiil. You can find traces of this campaign's brutality throughout Skyrim, if you know where to look. Letters in Solitude reference the burning of the Imperial City, an event so catastrophic that it became a permanent scar on the Empire's confidence. The White Gold Tower, the seat of imperial power since the days of Tiber Septim, was captured. For an empire that had stood for centuries as Tamriel's dominant power, the fall of its capital was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological one, and the shame of that loss informs nearly every decision the Empire makes in Skyrim during the events of the game. Ulfbert Warbear, the blacksmith you'll find working alongside his wife Adrienne at War Maidens in Whiterun, is one of the few NPCs whose personal history connects directly to this disaster. Letters in his workshop hint at memories of comrades left behind during the fall of the Imperial City, and though his story is rarely framed as Civil War lore, it's worth remembering as you walk through Whiterun's market that the Great War didn't just reshape politics. It left behind broken men who carried the experience for the rest of their lives. Men who went on to become ordinary tradesmen, trying to forget what they witnessed. The Empire eventually rallied. General Tullius, whom you'll meet leading Imperial forces throughout Skyrim's Civil War questline, fought in this earlier conflict, and it shaped his entire philosophy of war. Imperial counterattacks pushed the Thalmor back, and at the Battle of the Red Ring, the Empire reclaimed the Imperial City. It looked, for a moment, as though the war might end in something resembling Imperial victory, or at least survival with dignity intact. But the Empire's resources were exhausted. Tiber Septim's legacy of conquest had given the Empire centuries of momentum, but that momentum had run out by the time the Aldmeri Dominion came calling. Emperor Titus Mede II, facing a Thalmor army that could potentially destroy what remained of his empire entirely, made the decision that would set the entire chain of events in Skyrim's civil war into motion. He sued for peace. This is where the White Gold Concordat enters the story, and it's worth lingering on because nearly every grievance the Stormcloaks raise traces back to this single treaty. The Concordat's terms were severe. the Empire ceded a large portion of southern Hammerfell to the Dominion outright, and when the Red Guards refused to accept that loss and kept fighting, Titus Mede II was forced to formally renounce Hammerfell as an imperial province altogether in order to preserve the treaty. The Red Guards eventually fought the Dominion to a standstill on their own, signing a separate peace 5 years later, but the province never fully forgave the Empire for what it experienced as abandonment. Based on what we know of the broader pattern of Dominion expansion in the decades before this treaty, with Valenwood and elsewhere having already fallen under Thalmor control, it stands to reason that the Concordat was simply the latest and most visible chapter in a much longer story of the Empire steadily losing ground to the Dominion. The Empire's military capacity was also left severely depleted in the treaty's aftermath, with entire legions destroyed during the war, and the survivors having lost more than half their strength, a detail that explains much of the weakness Imperial forces still display by the time we reach the events of Skyrim itself. And then there was the clause that would echo through every Nord household in Skyrim for the rest of the era. The worship of Talos was banned throughout the Empire. The Concordat carried one more provision that rarely gets discussed alongside the Talos ban, but that matters enormously to how the broader Imperial Thalmor relationship functions throughout the events of Skyrim. The Blades, the ancient order of dragon-slaying agents who had served the Empire and its emperors since the days of the Akaviri invasion, were forced to disband entirely. This detail might seem like a footnote next to the religious and territorial humiliations of the treaty, but it's worth pausing on because it explains why Delphine and Esbern, the last known Blades you encounter during Skyrim's main questline, operate the way they do, hidden, distrustful of the current Empire, forced into secrecy rather than serving openly as their predecessors once did. The Thalmor demanded the Blades' disbandment specifically because the order represented institutional imperial resistance to Aldmeri influence, and removing them stripped the Empire of one more layer of independent strength, leaving it more dependent than ever on negotiated peace, rather than its own internal capacity for resistance. It's important to understand why this clause cuts so deep, because to modern ears, it might sound like a minor diplomatic concession. Talos worship, to the Nord specifically, isn't simply a matter of religious preference among many available choices. Talos is Tiber Septim, the man who became a god through deeds, the embodiment of the idea that mortal courage and conquest can elevate someone into the nine divines. For Nords, who pride themselves on strength, self-reliance and martial glory, Talos represents the ultimate validation of those values. Banning his worship wasn't just removing a god from a shrine. It was the Empire telling every Nord in Skyrim that their highest cultural ideal, the proof that strength and honor could transcend mortality itself, was now illegal to even acknowledge. It's worth remembering, too, just how directly Tiber Septim's life intersects with Skyrim's own sense of itself, since this connection is precisely what makes the ban feel so personal rather than abstract. Born Talos of Atmora by some accounts, and raised among Nords before rising to conquer and unify all of Tamriel under a single banner, Tiber Septim's path to godhood ran directly through the same warrior culture that produced every Stormcloak soldier marching under Ulfric's banner centuries later. He is remembered not as a distant emperor handed power through inheritance, but as a man who earned his throne and, eventually, his divinity through conquest, strategy, and sheer force of will, the same qualities Nords have spent generations teaching their children to admire in the songs sung by bards in every tavern from Windhelm to Solitude. Asking Nords to stop worshipping him wasn't simply asking them to abandon a religious practice. it was asking them to look away from the clearest possible proof that a mortal, born under circumstances not unlike their own, could rise to stand among the 9 divines, a proof that many Nords considered too central to their identity to ever fully relinquish, regardless of what any treaty signed in a distant city demanded of them. You can see the wound this left if you visit the Temple of Talos in Windhelm, where Heimskr stands outside preaching with an intensity that borders on madness. Heimskr's sermons, delivered daily regardless of whether anyone listens, aren't simply religious fervour for its own sake. Based on what can be pieced together from his dialogue and the broader context of Windhelm's culture, Heimskr represents a kind of last stand for a faith under siege, a man who refuses to accept that the Empire's pen could erase what generations of Nords had built their identity around. His desperation, his volume, his refusal to be silenced even as Windhelm's guards and Stormcloak soldiers walk past him indifferent to his message. All of it tells the story of how the Talos ban created not just political resentment, but genuine spiritual grief among the Nord population. The Concordat signing took place, fittingly, in the Imperial City, under circumstances that many Nords considered shameful, regardless of their political affiliation. The Empire had not been destroyed. It had survived. But it had survived by abandoning provinces, by hollowing out its own military strength, and by banning the worship of the very figure who represented imperial unity and strength in the first place. There's a bitter irony here that the histories make clear. Talos worship was effectively criminalized by the Empire that Talos himself created, all in order to save that same empire from total collapse. This is the soil in which the Stormcloak rebellion would eventually grow, not from a single act of tyranny, but from a slow accumulation of humiliation, broken promises, and a sense among many Nords that the empire they had bled for in the Great War no longer represented their interests, their gods, or their pride. The Concordat created what amounts to 2 classes of grievance within Skyrim. There were those who saw the treaty as a necessary pragmatic sacrifice, a difficult but ultimately wise choice to preserve the empire against an enemy that could have annihilated it entirely. And there were those who saw it as a betrayal so deep that loyalty to the empire became, in their eyes, loyalty to weakness itself. It's worth noting too that the Thalmor's strategic patience didn't end with the Concordat signing. One interpretation suggests, based on documents that can be found within the Thalmor embassy near Solitude during the diplomatic immunity questline, that the Dominion never intended for the Concordat to be a final peace. Rather, it functioned as a staging period, a chance to weaken the empire further while appearing to respect the terms of a treaty that, in practice, kept the empire perpetually destabilized. The ban on Talos worship wasn't just about religious suppression for its own sake. It created a permanent, self-sustaining source of internal imperial conflict, one that would eventually erupt into exactly the kind of civil war that would weaken Skyrim and, by extension, the Empire as a whole, without the Thalmor needing to spend a single soldier or coin to make it happen. There's a further layer to this opening wound worth sitting with, one that becomes clearer the more time you spend exploring Skyrim's libraries and the College of Winterhold's archives. The White Gold Concordat didn't just ban Talos worship as an isolated religious restriction. It functioned, in practice, as a broader signal to every province within the empire that imperial protection could no longer be assumed as absolute. Hammerfell's population understood this immediately, refusing to accept the terms of their own abandonment and fighting a separate, grueling conflict to push Dominion forces out of their own lands rather than rely on an empire that had already proven willing to trade their sovereignty for peace. Skyrim watched this happen, and for many Nords, the lesson was unmistakable. The Empire's promises, however solemnly made, carried an expiration date determined entirely by how convenient those promises remained for Imperial survival. This precedent matters enormously for understanding why so many Nords would later view Ulfric's broken promise to the people of Markarth, and indeed Ulfric's broader rebellion, through a lens shaped by an empire that had already demonstrated on a Tamriel-wide scale exactly how easily treaties could be discarded when circumstances demanded it. This single insight reframes everything that follows. The civil war in Skyrim isn't simply a disagreement between Nords who want independence and Nords who want stability. It's the long-delayed detonation of a bomb the Thalmor planted decades earlier, one that both Ulfric Stormcloak and General Tullius are, in their own ways, still fighting inside of, without fully realizing whose interests are ultimately served by their conflict. We'll return to this thread later in our journey tonight, because it colors everything from the assassination of a High King to the burning of Helgen. But for now, simply hold onto the shape of it. A war fought far from Skyrim's borders, a treaty signed in shame, and a god's name struck from the lips of his most devoted worshippers. That is where Skyrim's civil war truly begins. Ulfric Stormcloak's rise and the Markarth incident. If the Great War and the White Gold Concordat planted the seed of rebellion, then Ulfric Stormcloak is the man who watered it with his own blood and conviction until it grew into something that could no longer be ignored. To understand the Civil War, you have to understand Ulfric not as a symbol, but as a person shaped by specific, traceable experiences, many of which you can learn about by simply listening closely during your travels through Windhelm, the Palace of the Kings, and the dialogue of those who knew him. Ulfric was born into Windhelm's ruling family, the son of Jarl Hogue, and from an early age the weight of Nord tradition and martial expectation sat on his shoulders. He trained as a warrior, but more importantly, he trained as a voice user, a practitioner of the Thu'um, the ancient art of shouting that connects Nords to their draconic heritage and to legendary figures like the heroes of the Dragon War. This detail matters more than it might initially seem. Ulfric isn't simply a politically ambitious Jarl. He is, in the eyes of many Nords, something closer to a living embodiment of the old ways. A man whose connection to the voice ties him directly to Skyrim's heroic past, to the same tradition that birthed Talos himself. Ulfric fought in the Great War as a young man, and it was during this conflict that he was captured by the Thalmor. This capture is one of the most consequential events in the entire Civil War, and it deserves careful attention because of what it implies about everything that follows. While held by the Thalmor, Ulfric was interrogated, and though the full details of what occurred during his captivity remain frustratingly incomplete in any text you can find in-game, a Thalmor dossier on Ulfric, discoverable within the Thalmor embassy during Delphine's questline, states plainly that contact was established with him after the war, and that he proved his worth as an asset. That same dossier goes on to note that the Markarth incident was particularly valuable to Thalmor's strategic goals in Skyrim, though it also admits Ulfric became generally uncooperative to direct contact afterward. Whether this language describes a man who knowingly cooperated with the Thalmor, or one whose predictable, deeply held convictions were simply observed and quietly exploited without his awareness, remains genuinely unclear, and reasonable people who've pored over this same dossier land on different sides of that question. What's harder to dispute is the underlying implication the Thalmor's own words leave behind, that Ulfric, by their own internal accounting, has functioned as something useful to Dominion interests since his time in their custody, regardless of how he understands his own choices. This is a deeply uncomfortable thread to follow, because Ulfric is, by every measure available to us through his actions and his dialogue, a true believer. He is not play acting at conviction. When he speaks of Talos, of Nord independence, of the indignity of the White Gold Concordat, there's no evidence of cynicism in his words. He genuinely believes Skyrim deserves better than what the Empire offered it, and yet, the data the Thalmor have compiled on him suggests that his rebellion, however sincere, plays directly into Dominion's strategy. A Skyrim divided against itself is a Skyrim that cannot mount a unified Imperial defense against future Thalmor ambitions. It stands to reason that this is precisely the outcome the Thalmor have quietly cultivated since his capture, using a man's authentic patriotism as an unwitting weapon against the very empire he claims to be liberating his people from. After the Great War ended and the Concordat was signed, Ulfric returned to Windhelm transformed. The humiliation of the treaty, combined with whatever psychological toll his captivity took on him, hardened his resolve. He began to speak more openly about Talos worship, about Nord pride, about the idea that Skyrim's destiny belonged in Nord hands, rather than in the hands of an empire that had bent the knee to elven dominance. This rhetoric found fertile ground, particularly among Nords who had also fought in the Great War and who carried their own grievances about the cost of that conflict. But it was the Markarth incident that truly transformed Ulfric from a vocal dissident into a figure capable of leading armed rebellion. To understand the Markarth incident, you need to understand the city itself first. Markarth sits in the Reach, a hold whose native population, the Reachmen, have a long and bitter history of resisting both Nord and Imperial rule. The Forsworn, the violent insurgent group that still plagues the Reach during the events of Skyrim, are the descendants of this resistance, having been driven from Markarth and into the surrounding wilderness generations earlier when Nords first conquered the city. It's worth pausing here to sit with the uncomfortable symmetry this creates, because the Reach's history complicates any easy framing of Nords as Skyrim's sole rightful inhabitants fighting against foreign imperial overreach. The Reachmen were Markarth's own people, long before any Nord ever marched on the city's walls, and the Forsworn's grievance against Nord rule echoes, in its broad shape, the very grievance Ulfric himself holds against the Empire. Both groups consider themselves dispossessed of land and tradition by a more powerful outside force. Both frame their violence as a justified response to conquest and cultural erasure. The difference, as far as most Nords are concerned, lies entirely in whose conquest came first and whose claim to the land is considered legitimate, a distinction that says more about who currently holds power than about any consistent moral principle separating one side's resistance from the other's. This parallel rarely gets acknowledged within Stormcloak rhetoric, and it's worth carrying forward as a quiet undercurrent throughout the rest of tonight's story. A reminder that questions of rightful belonging in Skyrim rarely resolve as cleanly as either side's wartime propaganda would suggest. During the period after the Great War, the Forsworn launched what's now remembered as the Forsworn Uprising, retaking Markarth from Nord control. The city fell into Forsworn hands, and for a period, the old order in the Reach was overturned. It was Ulfric Stormcloak who led the campaign to retake the city. This is where his reputation as a warrior and a leader was forged in the eyes of many Nords, not in some abstract political sense, but through direct, visible military action that restored a Nord-held city to Nord hands. However, The way this promise unraveled is where the Markarth incident becomes morally complicated rather than simply heroic. And it's worth getting the mechanics of it exactly right, because the direction of the betrayal matters enormously to how Ulfric understood what happened to him. It was not Ulfric who made a promise to the city. It was Jarl Hrolfdir, Igmund's father, who approached Ulfric and his militia and promised that if they retook Markarth from the Forsworn, free and open worship of Talos would be restored within the city's walls as their reward. Ulfric agreed, marched his militia to Markarth's gates, and retook the city, reportedly using the power of his Thu'um in the fighting. For a time, Hrolfdir kept his word, and Talos worship flourished openly in Markarth, a small, hard-won island of religious freedom within an empire that had banned it everywhere else. This is where the betrayal landed, and it landed on Ulfric rather than from him. The Thalmor eventually discovered that Talos worship was being permitted in Markarth in direct violation of the White Gold Concordat, and they demanded the arrest of Ulfric and his men, threatening renewed war with the Dominion if the Empire failed to comply. Hrolfdir, faced with the prospect of reigniting a conflict the Empire had no strength left to fight, complied, and Ulfric was arrested alongside much of his militia. Based on what can be gathered from his own later dialogue and the accounts of those who remember the period, Ulfric spent approximately 7 years imprisoned as a result, from roughly 4 E176 to 4 E183, a long and formative stretch of his life lost to a cell because the freedom he had been promised, and that he had bled to secure for his people, was deemed too dangerous for the Empire to honor once the Thalmor took notice. But once the Empire reasserted its authority over the Reach in the aftermath, and once the political pressure from the Thalmor regarding Talos worship reasserted itself as well, that promise was broken. Talos worship in Markarth was suppressed once again, the same as everywhere else under Imperial governance. For Ulfric, this betrayal wasn't simply a policy reversal he himself walked back. It was, in his eyes, proof that the Empire could not be trusted to honor commitments made to the Nord people, even commitments that had already been kept once, even commitments secured through Nord blood spilled to retake a city for the Empire's own benefit. Years in an Imperial cell gave him ample time to harden that conviction. Unused dialogue and historical references suggest that Ulfric's bitterness over this betrayal and the long imprisonment that followed it became one of the defining grievances that pushed him from rhetoric toward action once he was finally released and returned home to Windhelm to bury his father and take up the title of Jarl. There's also a darker layer to the Markarth incident that the game leaves somewhat ambiguous, one that speaks to the brutal pragmatism beneath Ulfric's idealism. Some accounts suggest that civilians, including individuals who may have been forsworn but also potentially innocent residents caught in the chaos of reconquest, were killed during the retaking of the city, and that Ulfric's forces were not gentle in how they reasserted Nord control. If this is accurate, and the historical record within Skyrim leaves room for this interpretation without fully confirming it, then the Markarth incident reveals Ulfric not simply as a wronged idealist, but as a man capable of ruthless action when he believes the cause justifies it. This duality, a sincere believer in Nord freedom, who is also willing to employ brutal methods to achieve his goals, will become essential to understanding everything Ulfric does for the remainder of the Civil War, including the act that ignites the open rebellion, the killing of a High King. It's worth noting how the Markarth incident shaped Ulfric's reputation going forward, because the nickname that emerged from it, the Bear of Markarth, captures something important about how legends form even amid genuine moral ambiguity. To his supporters, the title evokes raw, fearsome strength. A man who could not be denied once he set his will against an enemy. To his detractors, the same nickname carries an undertone of brutality, the image of something less than fully civilized, a warrior whose methods owed more to ferocity than to honor. Both readings persist side by side throughout Skyrim, and the fact that nobody can fully agree on what the title actually means tells you everything about how contested Ulfric's legacy already was, years before he ever raised a blade against Torygg. Igmund, the current Jarl of Markarth, whom you'll meet seeking justice regarding the forsworn conspiracy, inherited a city still shaped by these old wounds. His own father made the original deals with the Silver Blood family that effectively trade Markarth's economic soul for stability, and the residue of the Markarth incident, the broken promises, the suppressed worship, the violence of reconquest, all of it lingers beneath the surface of a city that still feels, even generations later, like contested ground rather than settled territory. Walking through Markarth's stone corridors, with the constant presence of Thalmor Justicia Ondlamar patrolling for Talos worshippers, you're walking through the physical legacy of exactly the grievance that pushed Ulfric Stormcloak toward rebellion in the first place. By the time we reach the events of the game itself, Ulfric Stormcloak is no longer simply a dissatisfied Jarl. He is a man hardened by Thalmor captivity during the Great War, sharpened by military command during the Markarth uprising, and embittered by years spent in an imperial cell after a promise he had honorably earned was stripped away the moment it became diplomatically inconvenient. The stage was set. All that remained was the spark that would turn simmering resentment into open war, and that spark would come in the form of a duel, a death, and a city's gates thrown open in defiance of an empire that Ulfric Stormcloak no longer believed deserved his loyalty. The throat of the world and the death of High King Torygg. Every civil war needs a moment where the unspoken finally becomes undeniable, where words and grievances transform into blood that cannot be taken back. For Skyrim, that moment is the death of High King Torygg in solitude, struck down by Ulfric Stormcloak's voice in a duel that the Empire calls murder, and that Ulfric calls the oldest tradition Nords possess. To understand why this killing happened, and more importantly why Ulfric believed it was not only justified but proper, you need to understand the concept of Nord succession and challenge as it existed before imperial law reshaped Skyrim's political customs. Historically, among the Nords, a challenge to the throne through single combat was considered an entirely legitimate path to kingship. If a claimant believed the current High King was unfit, weak, or unworthy of the position, that claimant could challenge the king to ritual combat, and the outcome of that combat, win or lose, was considered legitimate and binding. This tradition predates the centralized authority of the Empire by centuries, rooted in the same warrior culture that produced the Companions, the ancient Draugr kings you find in Skyrim's many barrows, and the entire ethos of strength as the measure of worthiness to rule. High King Torygg, who held the throne in solitude prior to his death, was not, in Ulfric's assessment, a king who embodied the strength and resolve that Skyrim needed. Torygg came to the throne as the son of the previous High King, Islod, selected by the Moot in the customary way once his father passed, rather than through any personal feat of arms or widespread reputation, earned through deeds on the battlefield. This is a crucial distinction in Ulfric's worldview. To him, a throne inherited through bloodline and procedural selection, however legitimate by imperial-era custom, carried none of the weight that the older Nord tradition of strength and proven worth demanded of a true High King. Torygg represented, in Ulfric's eyes, exactly the kind of weak, Imperial aligned leadership that had allowed the White Gold Concordate's humiliations to stand unchallenged, that had allowed Talos worship to remain banned, that had allowed the old Nord ways to be slowly eroded in favor of accommodating an empire that Ulfric viewed as fundamentally compromised by its submission to the Aldmeri dominion. It's worth noting too, based on accounts of the period, that Torygg himself reportedly held a degree of personal admiration for Ulfric and some sympathy toward his grievances, a detail that makes the duel between them feel less like a clash of bitter enemies and more like a tragedy between two men who might, under different circumstances, have found common ground. When Ulfric challenged Torygg, it was, by his own understanding, and by the understanding of many traditionalist Nords, an entirely legal and honourable act according to the customs that predate imperial law. The duel took place in solitude, and Ulfric won, using his mastery of the Thu'um, the voice, to overpower Torygg in combat. This detail matters immensely because the manner of Torygg's death is part of what makes the act so controversial. Ulfric didn't simply best Torygg in a conventional sword fight. He used a shout, a power tied to dragons and to the legendary heroes of Nord history, the same power that we, as the Dragonborn, come to wield throughout Skyrim's main questline. To many Nords, this made the duel even more legitimate, a demonstration that Ulfric possessed not just political conviction, but a literal connection to the divine and ancestral forces that define Nord identity. To the Empire, and to Torygg's grieving widow Elisif, it made the killing look less like an honourable contest and more like the use of an almost supernatural weapon against a man who had no real chance to defend himself. This is the central, unresolved tension at the heart of the entire Civil War's founding act. Was Torygg's death a legitimate exercise of ancient Nord tradition, a fair challenge fought and won according to rules both men understood? Or was it a calculated assassination dressed up in the language of honor, using a power advantage that made any pretense of fairness meaningless? The game itself, through its many NPCs, refuses to fully resolve this question, and that ambiguity is intentional. It forces anyone investigating the war's origins to sit with genuine moral complexity, rather than a clean villain and a clean hero. It's worth understanding, too, that killing Torygg did not automatically make Ulfric High King, and this detail matters for understanding why the rest of the Civil War had to be fought at all, rather than simply ending the moment the duel concluded. The title of High King in Skyrim is formally conferred through the Moot, a gathering of the province's Jarls who vote to confirm a successor to the throne. Winning a duel might satisfy the old Nord sense of honor and worthiness, but it carries no formal weight within the political structure that Imperial-era governance had layered on top of Nord tradition. This is precisely why Ulfric needed the war at all. Defeating Torygg in single combat proved, in his own eyes and in the eyes of many traditionalist Nords, that he possessed the strength to rule. But translating that proof into an actual crown required winning over enough Jarls, by persuasion or by force, to secure a moot that would formally recognize his claim. The entire Civil War, in this light, can be understood as an extended bloody argument over whether Ulfric's victory in solitude should ever be allowed to reach that final formal vote. What we do know, through dialogue with Elisif the Fair in Solitude's Blue Palace, is that the loss devastated her personally and politically in equal measure. Elisif was never trained or prepared to rule. Her position as Torygg's wife had been largely ceremonial, and his sudden death thrust her into a position of authority she neither expected nor felt equipped to hold. Her grief, which manifests in quests involving Torygg's funeral horn and the burning of his effigy, isn't political theatre. It's a young woman processing the death of her husband, while an entire court of advisors with competing agendas circles around her, each trying to shape her into a tool for their own purposes. General Tullius wants her allegiance and military cooperation. The Thalmor want concessions. Falk Firebeard, her steward, tries to protect her interests, though even his motivations carry layers of complexity, given his own romantic feelings for her that go unspoken in most of their interactions. Unused dialogue suggests that during the depths of her grief, Elisif even considered taking her own life, and that only her sense of duty to Torygg's memory and to solitude kept her functioning during the darkest period after his death. For the Empire, Torygg's death could not be allowed to stand as a legitimate succession challenge, regardless of whatever ancient Nord tradition Ulfric invoked to justify it. The Empire, still recovering from the humiliation of the Great War and desperately needing stability in a province as strategically important as Skyrim, viewed Ulfric's actions as nothing less than the murder of a sitting high king allied with imperial interests. General Tullius, who arrives in Skyrim specifically to deal with the rebellion that follows, treats Ulfric not as a legitimate political rival, but as a traitor and a murderer. Language that you'll hear repeated throughout imperial dialogue across the game. From the Empire's perspective, allowing Ulfric's challenge to stand as legitimate would set a precedent that any Jarl with enough martial skill could simply kill their way to the throne, and in a province as fractious and tradition-bound as Skyrim, that precedent would guarantee permanent instability. It's worth pausing here to consider the framing the game offers in its opening moments, because it's not incidental that Skyrim begins with you, the player, captured alongside Ulfric Stormcloak himself, being transported to Helgen for execution. The official imperial position, voiced by the soldiers escorting the prisoners, is unambiguous. Ulfric is a murderer and a traitor. Full stop. There's no room in that initial framing for nuance about ancient dueling traditions, or Torygg's perceived unfitness to rule. And yet, the game immediately complicates this framing once you actually begin exploring Skyrim and listening to its people. You'll find that even among those who think Ulfric went too far, there's often a grudging acknowledgement that a throne passed down through bloodline and procedure lacked the kind of legitimacy that older Nord tradition demanded, and that Ulfric's challenge, however brutal in execution, tapped into something many Nords felt but had been too afraid or too politically cautious to say aloud. The Markarth incident had already convinced Ulfric that the Empire could not be trusted to honour agreements made with the Nord people. The death of Torygg was, in Ulfric's mind, not the beginning of a war, but the correction of an illegitimate arrangement, a king installed through bloodline and imperial-era procedure, replaced through the oldest and most honest method Nords possessed, trial by combat, decided by strength and by the voice itself. But intention and perception are two very different things, and regardless of how Ulfric justified the act to himself, the political reality was immediate and irreversible. The moment Torygg died in that duel, there was no path back to peaceful coexistence between Ulfric Stormcloak and the Empire he had just very publicly, very violently defied. The death of Torygg also reshaped solitude itself in ways that extend beyond Elisif's personal grief. The Blue Palace, once a seat of relatively settled imperial-aligned governance, became overnight a court adrift, its halls filled with advisors maneuvering for influence over a young widow none of them had expected to actually rule. Falk Firebeard's careful stewardship, General Tullius's growing military presence within the city, and the constant watchful interest of the Thalmor all converge on Elisif in the months following Torygg's death, each faction recognizing that whoever shapes her decisions effectively shapes Solitude's, and by extension a significant portion of Skyrim's, response to the rebellion now gathering strength in Windhelm. It stands to reason that Ulfric's choice to challenge Torygg specifically in Solitude, rather than through some other means, carried its own symbolic weight. Killing a High King in the very seat of imperial power within Skyrim was not simply a private matter of succession. It was a public, unmistakable statement that even within the Empire's own stronghold, the Old Nord right of challenge still held force, regardless of what imperial law might claim to the contrary. What followed was swift. Word of Torygg's death spread through Skyrim's holds, and reactions split almost immediately along lines that had already been forming for years based on each region's relationship with imperial rule, with Talos worship, and with Ulfric's own reputation as a war hero and a man of conviction. Some Jarls saw the killing as confirmation that Ulfric was exactly the kind of dangerous, power-hungry zealot the Empire needed to suppress before he tore Skyrim apart. Others saw it as the first genuinely honest political act in a generation, a Nord finally willing to act according to Nord tradition, rather than bowing to an empire that had already shown through the White Gold Concordat that it would sacrifice Nord interests whenever convenient. It's at this point that the simmering tension we trace back to the Great War and the Markarth incident finally crystallizes into open conflict. Ulfric did not wait passively for imperial justice to find him. He fled Solitude and returned to Windhelm, his ancestral seat of power, and from there he began doing what he had clearly been preparing to do for years, even if he hadn't consciously admitted it to himself. He began assembling an army. The duel that killed Torygg wasn't simply the end of one king's life. It was the opening act of a war that would eventually divide every hold, every Jarl, and nearly every household in Skyrim along lines of loyalty, tradition, and belief that had been quietly hardening since the day the White Gold Concordat was signed in a city far from Skyrim's borders. The Stormcloak rebellion takes shape. Once Torygg lay dead and Ulfric had returned to Windhelm, the question facing every Jarl, every soldier, and every common citizen in Skyrim became unavoidable. Which side do you stand on? This was not a decision made quickly or lightly, and the way the rebellion organized itself, the way it found its soldiers, its symbols, and its strategic footing, reveals as much about Skyrim's deep cultural fractures as the war's origins do. Ulfric's first and most essential ally in building the rebellion was Galmar Stonefist, a grizzled war veteran who serves as his second-in-command throughout the Stormcloak questline, and whom you'll find at the war table in the Palace of the Kings in Windhelm, planning campaigns across a map of Skyrim. Galmar represents something important about the rebellion's character. He is not a political theorist or a religious zealot. He is a soldier's soldier, someone who fought alongside Ulfric in earlier conflicts, and who lends the rebellion a sense of military legitimacy and battlefield competence that pure ideology alone could never provide. When you speak with Galmar, his dialogue carries the weight of someone who has seen enough war to know its costs, and yet who believes those costs are worth paying for Skyrim's independence from an empire he views as fundamentally compromised. It's worth pausing on two figures from Riverwood who, more than any Jarl or general, put a human face on exactly what this rebellion asked of ordinary Nords. Ralof and Hadvar grew up in the same small village, and by the time the main questline begins, they find themselves on opposite sides of the very ambush at Darkwater Crossing that captures both Ulfric and the future Dragonborn. Ralof fights for the Stormcloaks, Driven by the same grievances over Talos worship and Nord pride that animate Ulfric's broader cause, while Hadvar serves the Empire, believing, much like Legate Rikke, that unity and stability serve Skyrim better than rebellion. When Alduin's attack on Helgen throws the entire execution into chaos, both men help guide the player to safety, each according to his own allegiance, and the game allows you to witness, side by side in the span of a single chaotic escape, two Nords who likely played together as children, now bound to factions that will eventually demand they kill soldiers who could just as easily have been each other. Their story doesn't resolve neatly. Depending on the choices made throughout the rest of the Civil War questline, the two may never cross paths again, or they may find themselves on opposite ends of a battlefield in some later siege. Two friends from Riverwood reduced to enemy combatants by a treaty signed in a city neither of them will ever see, over a god neither of them stopped believing in. The rebellion took its name, the Stormcloaks, from Ulfric's own moniker, Ulfric Stormcloak, a name that itself carries layers of meaning rooted in Nord reverence for the elements and the harsh beauty of Skyrim's landscape. The symbolism mattered. A movement built around Talos worship and Nord pride needed iconography that felt ancient and elemental rather than bureaucratic, and the Stormcloak banner, with its stylized bear, became a visual rallying point that you'll see flying over Windhelm and at every Stormcloak-held city throughout the game. Windhelm itself became the natural capital of the rebellion, and it's worth understanding why this particular city, more than any other Nord stronghold, served as the seedbed for Stormcloak ideology. Windhelm is one of the oldest Nord settlements in Skyrim, predating even the unification under Tiber Septim, and its very architecture, the dark stone, the ancient palace, the proximity to harsh northern wilderness, reinforces a sense of continuity with a Nord past that feels uncorrupted by imperial influence. It's also worth noting Windhelm's uncomfortable relationship with its Dunmer population in the Grey Quarter, a detail that complicates any simple narrative of Stormcloak nobility. The same city that serves as the heart of Nord pride and independence is also a city where racial tension against Dark Elf refugees runs deep, and this tension exists in uncomfortable tandem with the rebellion's rhetoric about freedom and self-determination, a contradiction that the game never fully resolves and that thoughtful players are left to reckon with on their own. As Ulfric's forces organized, the Empire was forced to respond, and this is where General Tullius enters the story as the Stormcloak's primary military opposition. Tullius is a career military officer, a man who fought in the Great War and who carries that war's lessons with him into every decision he makes regarding the rebellion. From dialogue, you can gather across the Imperial questline. Tullius views the Stormcloak rebellion through a lens shaped entirely by pragmatism and stability. He has no particular love for the Thalmor or for the Talos worship ban itself. Based on what we know of his character through his interactions, it stands to reason that Tullius might privately sympathize with some Nord grievances regarding the Concordat's terms. But his job, as he understands it, is to prevent Skyrim from fracturing during a period when the Empire can least afford internal instability, particularly with the ever-present threat of renewed Thalmor aggression looming on the horizon. Tullius is joined by Legate Rikke, herself a Nord who chose to remain loyal to the Empire rather than join Ulfric's cause, a decision that places her in a particularly fraught position throughout the war. Rikke represents perhaps the most psychologically complex figure within the Imperial Legion's command structure, precisely because she embodies the argument against the assumption that Nord identity and Imperial loyalty are inherently incompatible. Her dialogue throughout the questline, especially during moments when Imperial forces clash with Stormcloak soldiers who are, in many cases, literally her countrymen, and sometimes even people she once called friends, reveals a woman who believes deeply that unity under the Empire, despite its flaws, offers better long-term protection for Skyrim than the chaos and uncertainty of full independence. When you fight alongside Ricker during the Imperial campaign, you're fighting alongside someone whose loyalty to the Empire isn't naive blindness to Nord grievances, but a calculated belief that those grievances are better addressed through reform and stability rather than rebellion and war. The opening battles of the Civil War, the ones that establish the early shape of the conflict before the player even arrives in Skyrim, centered initially around control of strategic territory. Stormcloak forces moved to consolidate the holds where Talos worship remained strong and where local Jarls were sympathetic to Ulfric's cause, while Imperial forces worked to shore up support in the holds, like Whiterun under Jarl Balgruf and Solitude under the grieving but still nominally Imperial-aligned Elisif, where pragmatism or direct Imperial military presence kept the population from rallying to Ulfric's banner. It's during this early period of rebellion organization that the famous scene depicted at the very start of the game, the attempted execution at Helgen, takes place. Ulfric himself was captured by Imperial forces, a major blow to the Stormcloak cause given that the rebellion's entire identity was built around his personal leadership and his connection to the Voice. His capture, along with several of his soldiers, set the stage for what should have been a swift and decisive end to the rebellion through public execution, a statement meant to demonstrate Imperial resolve and discourage any further Nord uprising. That execution, of course, never reaches its conclusion, interrupted by the sudden and catastrophic arrival of Alduin, the World Eater, whose attack on Helgen becomes the inciting incident for the entire main questline of Skyrim. This detail is worth dwelling on for a moment because of what it reveals about the strange entanglement between the game's two major storylines. The Civil War and the Return of Dragons are not separate narratives running in parallel. They are deeply intertwined from the very first moments of the game, with the Dragon Crisis effectively buying Ulfric Stormcloak his freedom and his life, allowing the rebellion to continue rather than ending in a swift, anticlimactic execution outside Helgen's walls. Based on what we know of the timeline, had Alduin not chosen that precise moment to attack, the entire Civil War might have ended before it truly began, with Ulfric's death at the headsman's block serving as a cautionary tale rather than the opening chapter of a prolonged and devastating conflict. Following the chaos at Helgen, Ulfric returned to Windhelm and resumed command of the rebellion with renewed intensity, and from there, the war began to take the shape that defines it throughout the rest of the game. Both sides began actively recruiting, with Stormcloak agents traveling to Nord settlements throughout Skyrim, appealing to cultural pride, religious grievance, and resentment over the Talos ban, while Imperial recruiters emphasized stability, the dangers of fracturing Skyrim during a period of renewed dragon activity, and the practical benefits of remaining under the broader protection and trade networks the Empire still provided, despite its weakened state. This recruitment effort is where the war stops being an abstract political conflict between two leaders and becomes something that touches every level of Skyrim society. Common citizens, innkeepers, farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants found themselves having to choose sides, or at least having to navigate a Skyrim where choosing no side at all was becoming increasingly difficult. The bards you'll hear singing in taverns throughout Skyrim carry songs about Ulfric's deeds and Nord pride that double as recruitment propaganda. a detail that speaks to how the rebellion understood the importance of cultural narrative in building support beyond pure military strength. Meanwhile, imperial couriers and officials worked to remind the population of the practical chaos and danger that outright rebellion against the empire could bring, particularly given the still present threat of renewed Thalmor interest in a divided and weakened province. By the time you, as the newly revealed Dragonborn, begin making your way through Skyrim's main quest, the rebellion is already a fully formed military and political force, with control over significant territory, a functioning command structure, and a growing list of holes whose Jarls have either openly declared for Ulfric or quietly begun providing support behind the scenes. The stage was set not for a quick skirmish, but for a prolonged, grinding conflict that would test the loyalty, conviction, and survival instincts of every major and minor figure across Skyrim's 9 holds. A conflict whose resolution would ultimately depend on which side could convince enough Jarls, enough soldiers, and enough ordinary people that their vision of Skyrim's future was the one worth fighting and dying for. The case for the Stormcloaks. To understand why so many Nords across Skyrim chose to fight and die under Ulfric's Stormcloak's banner, you need to set aside the question of whether Torygg's death was justified and instead sit with the deeper, more emotionally resonant arguments that drew ordinary people, not just soldiers and Jarls, into the rebellion's cause. The Stormcloak case isn't simply political theory. It's built from genuine grievances that touch culture, religion, economics, and a sense of dignity that many Nords felt had been stripped from them by decades of imperial accommodation toward the Aldmeri dominion. The clearest and most visceral argument for the Stormcloak cause is the restoration of Talos worship. This cannot be overstated as a motivating factor, and it's worth returning to the image of Heimskr preaching in Windhelm's streets to understand why. For Nords, the right to worship Talos isn't an abstract religious freedom issue removed from daily life. It's deeply tied to the very identity of what it means to be Nord, a people who venerate strength, deeds, and the idea that mortal courage can ascend into divinity. Every shrine to Talos that sits hidden or destroyed throughout Skyrim, every household forced to whisper prayers rather than speak them openly, represents a small, accumulated humiliation. The Stormcloaks promise, fundamentally, that an independent Skyrim, free from the White Gold Concordate's restrictions, would restore the open worship of Talos, undoing what many Nords considered the single greatest injustice of the post-Great War settlement. It's worth dwelling for a moment on what this suppression actually looks like in daily practice, because the abstraction of a ban can obscure just how invasive its enforcement becomes. Families who maintain private shrines, tucked away in cellars or hidden behind false walls, live with the constant low hum of risk that comes from practicing a faith that's been criminalized by treaty rather than by any genuine theological argument against Talos's divinity. Markarth's situation under Ondolamar's watchful eye represents the most visible version of this enforcement, but similar tension exists quietly in nearly every hold, with Thalmor informants and sympathetic officials creating an atmosphere where devotion to a god the Nords consider central to their entire cultural identity must be practiced in secrecy, as though it were itself a kind of crime rather than an act of faith. The Stormcloaks frame their cause again and again around the simple, visceral injustice of this arrangement, that a people should have to hide their prayers in their own homeland under the watch of foreign agents who answer to an empire that humiliated Skyrim's Nords in war, and then asked them to surrender their gods as the price of peace. Beyond religion, the Stormcloak cause taps into a powerful argument about self-determination and cultural survival. Nords across Skyrim, particularly in holds like Windhelm and Eastmarch, where traditional values run deepest, often express a sense that the Empire, in its current weakened and Thalmor-influenced state, no longer represents Nord interests at all. The argument goes something like this. Skyrim has always been able to govern itself, has always produced its own warriors, its own kings, its own laws suited to its harsh climate and proud traditions, long before Tiber Septim's unification brought it under centralized imperial control. Why, the Stormcloaks ask? Should Skyrim continue bending to the will of a distant empire that just sacrificed Hammerfell, that banned Talos worship under Thalmor pressure, and that allows Thalmor justiciars like Ondalimar to roam freely through cities like Markarth, investigating and persecuting Nords for worshipping their own god on their own soil? This argument finds its sharpest expression in the experience of ordinary Nords who encounter Thalmor agents during their daily lives. The dialogue you'll hear from Stormcloak soldiers often returns to this same well of resentment. The idea that the Empire allowed foreign elves, agents of the very nation that humiliated Skyrim in the Great War, to operate with near impunity within Nord cities, monitoring religious practice, and reporting violations as though Skyrim were occupied territory rather than a proud and sovereign province of the Empire. For many Nords, the presence of Thalmor justiciars isn't a minor inconvenience. It's a daily, visible reminder of subjugation, and the Stormcloaks position themselves as the only force willing to actually do something about it, rather than simply tolerating Thalmor presence in the name of diplomatic stability. The Stormcloak cause also carries a strong economic and practical dimension that often goes underappreciated in discussions that focus purely on religious freedom. Many of the rural holds, the ones most heavily populated by traditional Nord farming and herding communities, feel neglected by an imperial administrative structure that they perceive as more concerned with maintaining trade relationships and diplomatic stability than with addressing the practical hardships of life in Skyrim's harsher regions. The Stormcloaks present themselves as champions of these overlooked communities, promising a Skyrim governed by Nords who understand Nord problems, rather than administered at a remove by imperial bureaucracy, more concerned with broader Tamriel-wide concerns than with the day-to-day struggles of farmers in Eastmarch or hunters in the Pale. The Reach offers perhaps the starkest illustration of this economic grievance, even though the hold itself, as we discussed earlier, remains nominally under imperial allegiance for most of the war. Walking through Markarth's mining district, you'll find men like Banning, trapped beneath the city in Sanuarak mine, working off debts to the Silverblood family that compound faster than honest labor could ever hope to repay. His wages siphoned away before they ever reach the family he's trying to support elsewhere in Skyrim. This isn't simply a local labor dispute. It's the kind of exploitation that the Stormcloaks argue flourishes precisely because imperial law, focused on stability and the protection of existing economic arrangements, does nothing to intervene on behalf of workers like Banning, so long as Thonar Silverblood's tribute keeps flowing and Markarth's mines keep producing ore for export. From the Stormcloak perspective, an independent Skyrim governed by Nords answerable to Nord communities, rather than to imperial trade interests, might at least offer the possibility of reform that the current arrangement, content to let the Silverbloods run the Reach as something close to a private fiefdom, has shown no inclination to pursue. There's also the matter of martial pride and the warrior culture that defines so much of Nord identity, something the Stormcloak cause taps into perhaps more effectively than any other aspect of its messaging. Skyrim's history, found throughout countless books and journals scattered in its ruins and libraries, is steeped in stories of legendary heroes, of Ysgramor and the 500 companions, of ancient kings who carved out Skyrim's borders through strength and shouts and sheer Nord stubbornness. The Stormcloak rebellion offers ordinary Nords a chance to participate in that same heroic tradition, to be part of a story about reclaiming Nord destiny, rather than simply living out their lives as subjects of a distant, weakened empire. Galmar Stonefist's gruff, battle-hardened presence at the war table in Windhelm embodies this appeal perfectly. He's not selling abstract political theory. He's offering the chance to be a Nord warrior fighting for something that matters, in a tradition that stretches back to the earliest days of Skyrim's history. The Skyforge above Whiterun, where the companions still craft their legendary weapons using techniques passed down since Ysgramor's own time, stands as a physical reminder of exactly what this martial tradition means to ordinary Nords, even those with no direct connection to the companions themselves. It represents continuity, an unbroken line stretching back to the founding of Nord civilization in Skyrim, forged in fire and steel rather than negotiated through treaties signed in distant cities. The Stormcloaks understand intuitively that this same hunger for continuity, for participation in something larger and older than any individual life, can be channeled into political conviction just as easily as it's channeled into joining a guild of mercenary warriors. Ulfric's rebellion offers exactly that promise. Not simply a political outcome, but a chance to stand alongside heroes whose names will be remembered the way Ysgramor still is, centuries after the companions first answered his call against the Snow Elves. It's also worth considering the argument, often made implicitly through the rebellion's actions, rather than stated outright in dialogue, that the Stormcloaks represent a kind of accountability that the current Imperial-aligned leadership structure lacks. Ulfric's challenge to Torygg, however one judges its morality, was at least an action taken in the open, according to ancient and understood rules, by a man willing to risk his own life in single combat to make his point. Compare this to the situation in Riften, where Jarl Lila Lawgiver sits as a figurehead, while Maven Blackbriar's criminal empire operates the city from the shadows, or to Windhelm's own history of broken promises during the Markarth reconquest. The Stormcloak cause, despite the moral complications around Ulfric's own methods, presents itself as more honest about where power actually lies and how it's actually exercised, compared to an imperial system riddled with the kind of behind-the-scenes corruption you encounter throughout Skyrim's political landscape. This is not to say the Stormcloak case is without serious moral complications, because it absolutely is, and we'll explore the case against the rebellion, and for the Empire, in the section that follows. But understanding why so many Nords genuinely believed in this cause, why farmers left their fields and hunters left their cabins to march under the Stormcloak banner, requires taking seriously the depth of cultural and religious grievance that the White Gold Concordat created, and the genuine appeal of a movement promising to restore not just political independence, but a deeper sense of Nord dignity and self-determination that many felt had been slowly eroded since the day that humiliating treaty was signed in a distant city most of them would never see. The case for the Empire. Just as the Stormcloak cause draws on real and deeply felt grievances, the Imperial Legion's case for preserving unity within Skyrim rests on its own set of compelling arguments, ones rooted in pragmatism, historical memory, and a genuine concern for what fragmentation might mean not just for Skyrim, but for all of Tamriel during a period of unprecedented danger. To dismiss the imperial position as simple colonial occupation misses the complexity that men like General Tullius and Legate Rika genuinely wrestle with throughout their service. The most immediate and pressing argument for imperial unity centers on the looming threat of the Aldmeri Dominion. The peace established by the White Gold Concorder was never, by anyone's serious assessment, meant to be permanent. Based on what can be gathered from Thalmor embassy documents and the broader political context the game presents, the Dominion's ultimate goals extend well beyond what was achieved during the Great War. A Skyrim consumed by civil war is a Skyrim that cannot contribute soldiers, resources, or stability to any future Imperial effort to resist renewed Thalmor aggression. Tullius understands this, with a clarity that comes from having personally fought in the Great War and witnessed firsthand what unprepared, divided resistance against the Thalmor actually costs. His insistence on crushing the rebellion quickly isn't born from cruelty or indifference to Nord grievances, but from a genuine fear that every month the civil war continues is a month. Skyrim becomes more vulnerable to the very enemy that engineered the Talos ban, and the broader humiliation of the Concordat in the first place. Imperial loyalists often point to Hammerfell's experience as a kind of cautionary parallel worth weighing carefully, even if the comparison isn't perfectly clean. When the Red Guards refused the Concordat's terms and fought the Dominion alone. After the Empire renounced the province, they did eventually force the Aldmeri Dominion to withdraw, a genuine and hard-won victory for independence achieved outside Imperial protection. But that victory came only after 5 additional years of brutal warfare that left southern Hammerfell devastated, its population diminished, its infrastructure in ruins, and its relationship with the Empire permanently strained. From the Imperial perspective, this is exactly the kind of outcome an independent Skyrim risks courting. Technically achieving the independence it sought, but only by absorbing a level of destruction and loss that makes the victory feel almost indistinguishable from defeat. Tullius and those who share his views would argue that Skyrim, fighting a war against its own countrymen, rather than a foreign invader, stands to gain far less from such a Pyrrhic outcome than Hammerfell ultimately did, since at least the Red Guards were fighting an external enemy, rather than tearing apart their own provincial fabric from within. This leads to perhaps the most intellectually devastating argument against the Stormcloak cause, one that we touched on earlier and will need to examine in even more depth shortly. The distinct possibility, supported by documentation found within the game itself, that Ulfric's rebellion, however sincere, ultimately serves Thalmor interests far more than it serves genuine Nord independence. If the Dominion's strategic goal has always been a weakened, divided empire incapable of mounting unified resistance, then a civil war within one of the Empire's most strategically important provinces achieves exactly that goal, without the Thalmor needing to lift a single sword. From this perspective, the Imperial Legion isn't simply defending bureaucratic authority for its own sake. It's attempting to deny the Thalmor a victory that a successful Stormcloak rebellion would hand them on a silver platter, regardless of how genuinely Ulfric and his followers believe in their cause. The Empire also offers a case rooted in the practical benefits of unity that often gets lost amid the more emotionally resonant Stormcloak appeals to religious freedom and cultural pride. Imperial administration, whatever its flaws, provides infrastructure, trade connections, and a broader framework of law that extends protection and economic opportunity beyond what any single independent Skyrim could likely sustain on its own, particularly in a weakened post-Great War world, where resources and alliances matter more than ever. You can see hints of this argument in the dialogue of various merchants and citizens throughout Skyrim, who, regardless of their personal feelings about Talos worship, express genuine concern about what disruption to established trade routes and imperial protection might mean for their livelihoods should the rebellion succeed in fully separating Skyrim from the Empire. The East Empire Company's presence in Solitude offers a concrete illustration of exactly what this argument means in practice. The company maintains shipping routes that connect Skyrim's ports to markets across Tamriel, and the docks beneath Solitude's cliffs, where you'll find Adelaza Vendici managing East Empire Company interests, represent a tangible link between Skyrim's economy and the broader Imperial trade network that an independent Skyrim would have to either rebuild from nothing or attempt to replace through entirely new arrangements with neighbouring provinces, who may have little incentive to extend the same favourable terms. Imperial loyalists point to this kind of economic infrastructure as evidence that severing ties with the Empire carries costs that extend well beyond the battlefield, costs that would be paid for years afterward by every farmer, blacksmith and merchant whose livelihood depends, whether they realize it or not, on supply chains and trade agreements that took generations of imperial administration to establish. There's also a powerful argument to be made, one that Legate Rikke embodies perhaps more effectively than any other character in the game, that Nord identity and imperial loyalty are not the contradictory forces the Stormcloak rhetoric often implies. Rikke is, by every measure, a proud Nord. Her dialogue throughout the Imperial questline carries the same cultural confidence and martial pride you find among Stormcloak soldiers, but she believes, with apparent sincerity, that Nord strength and Nord values are best preserved and projected through unity with the Empire rather than through fragmentation and rebellion. Her perspective challenges the binary that Ulfric's rhetoric often presents, the idea that you must choose between being a proud Nord and being a loyal Imperial subject. Rikke represents the case that those two identities can, and perhaps must, coexist if Skyrim is to survive the genuinely dangerous geopolitical moment it finds itself in. It's worth sitting with Rikke's specific perspective a little longer, because she offers something neither Tullius nor Ulfric can quite provide. The viewpoint of someone who has genuinely weighed both sides of the cultural argument and chosen Imperial loyalty, not out of ignorance of Nord grievance, but in spite of full awareness of it. When she speaks of the Stormcloaks during the campaign, there's no contempt in her tone for the underlying complaints about Talos worship or Imperial accommodation of the Thalmor. What she objects to is the method, the willingness to fracture Skyrim's unity and risk catastrophic internal bloodshed over grievances she believes could, in time, be resolved through continued Imperial reform and renewed strength once the Empire recovers from the Great War's wounds. Her position implicitly argues that patience, however difficult and however bitter in the short term, serves Nord interests better than the immediate gratification of rebellion, particularly when that rebellion's ultimate beneficiary may not be Skyrim at all. The Imperial case also includes a more uncomfortable but historically grounded argument about the nature of Ulfric's actions themselves, separate entirely from the question of Talos worship or Nord pride. Regardless of ancient dueling traditions, the killing of a sitting High King through what many consider an unfair use of the Thu'um sets a precedent that threatens the very stability the Empire is trying to preserve. If political disputes in Skyrim can be settled through assassination dressed in the language of honourable challenge, what stops the next ambitious Jarl from doing the same thing to Ulfric himself, should he succeed in becoming High King? Tullius and those loyal to the Empire often frame their opposition to the Stormcloaks not purely as defense of abstract imperial authority, but as defense of a stable, predictable system of succession and governance that protects Skyrim from descending into a cycle of perpetual challenge and counter-challenge among ambitious warlords, each invoking tradition to justify the next act of violence. It's also worth considering the perspective of Jarls like Bolgruf, the Greater in Whiterun, who maintains careful neutrality for much of the early war specifically, because he sees the practical wisdom in avoiding the kind of zealous commitment to either side that he believes will ultimately devastate Skyrim regardless of which side wins. Balgruf's reluctance to fully commit reflects a broader imperial-aligned argument that the war itself, regardless of its underlying causes, represents a tragedy that thoughtful leadership should seek to minimize and end as quickly as possible, rather than pursue to its bloody conclusion in service of ideological purity on either side. Whiterun's central position within Skyrim's geography makes Balgruf's caution especially significant from a purely strategic standpoint, a detail worth dwelling on for a moment. Dragon's Reach sits roughly equidistant from Windhelm, Solitude, Markarth and Riften, making the Hold a natural crossroads for trade, troop movement, and communication between every other corner of the province. Whoever controls Whiterun effectively controls Skyrim's internal lines of supply and reinforcement, a fact that both Ulfric and Tullius understand perfectly well, even as they publicly frame their respective campaigns around loftier questions of faith and freedom. Balgruf's neutrality, then, isn't merely a matter of personal temperament. It's a recognition that Whiterun's geographic centrality makes premature commitment to either side an almost certain guarantee that his hold becomes the war's primary battleground regardless of which faction he chooses, since both armies will need to pass through or around Whiterun's territory at some point simply to reach one another. Holding out as long as possible, in this light, isn't indecision. It's the only strategy available to a Jarl who understands that his hold's importance makes neutrality itself a kind of fragile, temporary peace, one that both sides will eventually find too valuable to leave undisturbed. Finally, there's an argument the Empire makes, sometimes implicitly, and sometimes through direct dialogue from Imperial officers, about the danger of the kind of insular Nord nationalism that some elements of the Stormcloak movement express. Windhelm's treatment of its Dunmer population in the Grey Quarter, the casual prejudice you'll encounter from various Stormcloak-aligned NPCs toward non-Nord races throughout Skyrim, complicates the rebellion's framing of itself as a movement purely about freedom and self-determination. The Empire's multicultural framework, whatever its bureaucratic flaws, and however compromised it's become through accommodation with the Thalmor, at least nominally provides legal protection and a place within Tamriel's broader society for the Dunmer, Argonians, Bretons, and other peoples who call Skyrim home, but who might find themselves marginalized or worse under an independent Nord state, organized around the kind of exclusionary cultural pride that animates significant portions of the Stormcloak movement. Taken together, the Imperial case isn't simply about loyalty to bureaucratic authority or indifference to Nord's suffering under the Talos ban. It's a case built on hard-won historical memory of what the Thalmor are capable of, on practical concerns about infrastructure and stability, on a belief that Nord identity need not require independence to remain intact, and on legitimate worry about what kind of Skyrim might emerge from a rebellion led by a man whose conviction, however sincere, was forged partly in Thalmor captivity under circumstances that remain disturbingly unclear even to this day. The Jarls and the Holds why each side was chosen. Skyrim's 9 holds, each governed by its own Jarl, became the true battleground upon which the Civil War's ideological arguments played out in practical, political terms. Understanding why each Jarl chose the side they did reveals the war not as a simple binary of Nord versus Empire, but as a complex mosaic of personal history, regional interest, and individual conviction that shaped the conflict's actual military and political reality. Windhelm, governed by Ulfric Stormcloak himself, was always destined to be the rebellion's seat of power. But it's worth remembering that Ulfric's authority here predates the Civil War entirely. As the hereditary Jarl, his personal history with the Markarth incident, his captivity at Thalmor hands, and his deep-rooted belief in Nord tradition all found their most natural expression in a city that itself embodies ancient Nord continuity. Windhelm's Palace of the Kings, with its war room and map of Skyrim covered in markers showing troop movements, became the literal command center of the entire rebellion, and the city's populace, steeped in traditional values and largely sympathetic to the Talos worship ban's reversal, provided the rebellion with both manpower and ideological conviction from the very beginning. Markarth, under Jarl Igmund, occupies a far more complicated position. Despite the Reach's history with Ulfric, who personally led the campaign to retake the city from forsworn occupation, Markarth ultimately remains under imperial allegiance throughout most of the war, largely due to the economic and political influence of the Silverblood family. Thonar Silverblood's vast wealth, built on the mines that provide much of the Reach's economic output, and his arrangement with the imprisoned forsworn leader Madanak, gives him enormous influence over Igmund's decisions. Igmund himself, the son of Hrolfdir, who inherited the title after his father's passing, finds himself caught in an uncomfortable position regarding the legacy of his father's broken promise. He doesn't fully trust the Empire, given the continued presence of Thalmor Justicia on Dolimar, actively persecuting Talos worshippers within his own city, but he also carries the awkward knowledge that it was his own father's capitulation to Thalmor pressure, not any failure of Ulfric's, that ended Markarth's brief experiment in open worship. His allegiance to the Empire, then, is less an enthusiastic embrace of imperial values and more a pragmatic acceptance of an arrangement that, however imperfect, at least provides some stability against the forsworn threat that continues to plague the Reach. Riften, under Jarl Layla Lawgiver, presents perhaps the most cynical example of how the Civil War's grand ideological arguments get filtered through purely local, often corrupt, political realities. Layla's allegiance to the Empire is shaped almost entirely by the influence of Maven Blackbriar, whose criminal empire effectively controls Riften's actual governance regardless of who sits on the throne. Maven's economic interests, tied closely to imperial trade relationships and the legal protections that imperial law provides for her business operations, including the East Empire Company connections that benefit her smuggling and legitimate trade operations alike, make imperial alignment the obvious choice for maintaining her power. Layla's own willful blindness to Maven's actual control over Riften, as her steward Anuriel quietly serves Maven's interests rather than the Jarl's, means that Riften's allegiance in the Civil War has less to do with genuine political conviction than with the practical interests of the criminal network that actually runs the city from the shadows. It's worth considering what this means for Riften's ordinary citizens caught beneath this arrangement. The merchants like Bercy Honeyhand and craftsmen like Madesi, who go about their daily business in a city whose nominal allegiance has nothing to do with their own beliefs about Talos worship or imperial governance and everything to do with one woman's criminal ambitions. The Civil War, for Riften, was never really fought over ideology at all. It was simply one more variable Maven needed to manage, one more piece of leverage to maintain, a backdrop against which her actual business of skooma, extortion, and quiet political control could continue largely undisturbed regardless of which banner ultimately flew over Mistvale Keep. Solitude, the imperial capital of Skyrim and home to Elisif the Fair, represents the most obvious bastion of imperial loyalty, though even here the situation carries more complexity than it first appears. Elisif's grief over Torygg's death, combined with the constant presence of General Tullius and the Imperial Legion's primary base of operations at Castle Dour, makes Solitude's allegiance almost inevitable from a practical standpoint. But Elisif's own dialogue reveals a woman who, despite her loyalty to the Empire and her grief over her husband, occasionally hints at sympathy for legitimate Nord grievances, suggesting that her allegiance is driven as much by personal trauma and the practical reality of her position as by deep ideological conviction. Should the player help Ulfric's forces eventually take Solitude in a Stormcloak victory playthrough, Elisif's fate becomes one of the war's most poignant illustrations of how thoroughly individual lives get reshaped by political outcomes far beyond their control. Falk Firebeard's role in Solitude deserves a moment of consideration as well, since his quiet, steady presence at Elisif's side throughout the war reveals a man whose loyalty operates on two levels simultaneously. As her steward, he serves the Empire's interests by keeping Solitude functioning, and Elisif positioned as a stable, cooperative figurehead for Imperial authority in Skyrim. But his dialogue and his careful, protective attention toward Elisif suggests something more personal beneath the political duty, an unspoken devotion that he never acts on, partly out of propriety and partly, it's worth inferring, out of genuine concern that pursuing anything more might compromise the fragile stability he's worked so hard to help her maintain during the hardest years of her life. It's worth noting that Solitude's own population, beyond the court itself, reflects a similar undercurrent of complexity. The city's bards, merchants, and guards live daily beneath the visible machinery of imperial power. The soldiers drilling near Castle Dour, the Thalmor embassy looming on its hill above the city, and yet many of them, in their private conversations and their reactions to Stormcloak sympathizers passing through, reveal a quieter ambivalence than the city's official imperial allegiance would suggest. Solitude is, after all, still a Nord city, with its own deep roots in the same warrior traditions that animate Windhelm, and the loyalty its people show toward the Empire often has as much to do with proximity to imperial military strength and economic opportunity as it does with any deep ideological rejection of Ulfric's underlying grievances about Talos worship and Nord pride. Whiterun, under Jarl Balgruuf the Greater, occupies the single most consequential position of neutrality in the entire conflict, and understanding why Balgruuf resists choosing a side for so long reveals one of the war's deepest truths. Balgruuf is, by every account available through his dialogue and the testimony of those around him, a thoughtful and pragmatic leader who recognizes that Whiterun's central geographic position makes it strategically vital to both sides, and that premature commitment to either faction risks devastating his hold, regardless of the war's ultimate outcome. Balgruuf privately holds sympathy for the restoration of Talos worship, a detail that emerges in his dialogue, but he distrusts what he perceives as Ulfric's reckless willingness to plunge Skyrim into war for the sake of ideological purity. His neutrality holds until the game's main questline forces his hand, typically through Stormcloak or Imperial demands tied to the Dragon Crisis unfolding simultaneously, at which point Whiterun's choice becomes one of the most consequential single decisions in the entire war. given the Hold's central position and military significance. Winterhold, governed by Jarl Corir, presents one of the war's more melancholy subplots. A Hold so diminished by the catastrophic collapse of the city centuries earlier that its political relevance to the broader civil war feels almost like an afterthought. Corir's allegiance leans imperial, but Winterhold's importance to either side is limited by its sheer poverty and depopulation, a detail that speaks to how unevenly the war's stakes are distributed across Skyrim's holds, with the wealthier, more populous regions carrying far more weight in determining the conflict's ultimate trajectory than struggling holds like Winterhold ever could. The Pale, governed by Jarl the Elder, leans towards Stormcloak sympathy, and it's here that Brina Marilis's quiet conspiracy becomes relevant to the broader war. Brina's patient, scheming to overthrow Skald and align Dawnstar more firmly with Imperial interests, contingent on an eventual Imperial victory, illustrates how the Civil War created opportunities for ambitious local figures to pursue their own political fortunes under the cover of the broader conflict's ideological framing, regardless of whether their personal motivations had anything to do with Talos worship or Nord pride at all. Falkreath and Hjalmarch, under Jarl Sidgir and Jarl Idgrod Ravencrone respectively, round out the hold-by-hold picture with their own particular flavours of allegiance shaped more by individual Jarl temperament and regional concerns than by sweeping ideological conviction. Sidgir's situation in Falkreath deserves a closer look, because his disposition toward the war reflects something other than principled neutrality. He inherited the Jarldom young, following the death of his uncle, and his dialogue throughout the game reveals a man more interested in personal comfort and avoiding inconvenience than in either Talos worship or imperial stability. His own steward, Nenya, effectively runs Falkreath's day-to-day governance, while Sidgir indulges himself, a dynamic that mirrors, on a smaller and more pathetic scale, the same kind of figurehead arrangement you find with Layla Lawgiver in Riften. Falkreath's allegiance, when it eventually tips one way or another, tends to follow whichever side seems most likely to leave Sidgir's comfortable arrangement undisturbed. A far cry from the passionate conviction driving men like Ulfric or Tullius. Idgrod Ravencrone in Hjalmarch presents a markedly different character entirely, one whose mystical reputation, including her ability to sense events before they happen, sets her apart from every other Jarl in Skyrim. Her hold, centered on the misty, waterlogged city of Morthal, has always existed somewhat apart from the rest of Skyrim's political concerns, and Idgrod's own dialogue suggests a woman who views the Civil War through a wider, almost prophetic lens, one less concerned with the immediate question of Talos worship, and more attuned to currents of fate and consequence that she alone seems able to perceive. Whether her premonitions reflect genuine supernatural insight, or simply the practiced intuition of a leader who has weathered Hjalmarch's isolation for decades, her hold's allegiance in the war often feels less like a calculated political decision, and more like an extension of her own unhurried, watchful temperament, content to let the storm pass through Skyrim's other holds before deciding how directly Morthal needs to involve itself at all. Taken together, the pattern that emerges across Skyrim's 9 holds is one where genuine ideological conviction about Talos worship, Nord independence, or imperial stability often matters less than the specific local political, economic, and personal circumstances each Jarl finds themselves navigating. The Civil War, in practice, becomes less a clean ideological struggle and more a patchwork of regional interests, personal grudges, economic dependencies, and individual conviction, all filtered through the broader narrative of Nord pride versus imperial stability, that Ulfric and Tullius each invoke to justify a war whose actual on-the-ground reality is far messier and more human than either side's propaganda would suggest. The Thalmor's hidden hand. No examination of Skyrim's civil war would be complete without returning, more deliberately this time, to the thread we've pulled at several times already throughout tonight's journey. The deeply unsettling possibility that the entire conflict, from its roots in the White Gold Concordat to its bloodiest battles, serves the strategic interests of the Aldmeri Dominion far more than it serves the interests of either Ulfric Stormcloak or General Tullius. This is, by its very nature, one of the more speculative threads of Civil War lore, and it deserves to be treated with appropriate care regarding what's confirmed versus what's strongly implied through the game's documentation and environmental storytelling. The evidence for Thalmor manipulation begins with Ulfric's capture during the Great War, a detail confirmed through his own background and reinforced by his dossier, a document found within the Thalmor embassy itself during the diplomatic immunity questline. That dossier states, in its own words, that contact was established with Ulfric after the war and that he proved his worth as an asset, and it singles out the Markarth incident specifically as particularly valuable to Thalmor's strategic goals in Skyrim. This single detail recontextualizes everything Ulfric has done since his return from Thalmor captivity, though it's worth being careful about how far to take the inference. One interpretation suggests the Thalmor cultivated him deliberately, recognizing in his temperament and his devotion to Talos exactly the kind of leader who could be nudged, however subtly, toward the kind of rebellion that would later serve their interests. A more cautious reading suggests something closer to opportunism, after the fact, that the Thalmor simply recognized, once his rebellion was already underway, how conveniently it served their long-term goals, and claimed credit for an outcome they merely observed, rather than orchestrated. The dossier's own language leaves room for either reading. What it doesn't leave room for is dismissing the connection entirely, since the document exists, in the Thalmor's own words, calling him useful to their cause. The strategic logic behind this interpretation holds up under scrutiny when you consider the broader Thalmor objectives established through the White Gold Concordat and reinforced by every piece of Thalmor activity you encounter throughout Skyrim. The Dominion's ultimate goal, based on what we know of their long-term strategy, is the complete and total subjugation or destruction of human civilization across Tamriel, with the eventual elimination of Talos worship serving as a key step in dismantling the Empire's ideological and religious foundations. A Skyrim consumed by civil war achieves multiple Thalmor objectives simultaneously without requiring direct Dominion military action. It weakens the Empire's overall military capacity by diverting Imperial Legion resources towards suppressing internal rebellion, rather than preparing for renewed conflict with the Dominion. It creates a pretext for continued and expanded Thalmor presence within Skyrim, under the guise of monitoring Talos worship violations, exactly the kind of presence you witness through Ondalamar's activities in Markarth. And it ensures that regardless of which side wins the civil war, Skyrim emerges from the conflict weakened, divided, and less capable of mounting unified resistance to future Thalmor ambition. This interpretation gains further weight when you consider how the Thalmor embassy operates throughout the events of Skyrim, maintaining what amounts to a parallel diplomatic and intelligence operation that exists almost entirely separate from the actual day-to-day conflict between Stormcloaks and Imperials. The Thalmor aren't depicted as actively fighting alongside either side in any of the war's actual battles. Their role is more insidious and more patient than direct military involvement, content to let Nords kill other Nords, while Thalmor agents quietly continue their broader work of monitoring Talos worship, gathering intelligence, and maintaining the kind of long-term strategic patience that defines their entire approach to reconquering what they view as their rightful dominance over Tamriel. It's worth pausing to consider what this means for how we understand Ulfric Stormcloak as a tragic figure, separate from any judgment about the morality of his actions regarding Torygg's death, or the broken promises of the Markarth incident. If the interpretation holds that Ulfric remains, even unknowingly, a Thalmor asset whose authentic conviction serves Dominion interests, then his entire rebellion becomes a kind of profound dramatic irony. Here is a man who believes, with apparent total sincerity, that he's liberating his people from imperial weakness and elven manipulation, who has built an entire movement around Nord pride and self-determination, who genuinely wants to see Talos worshipped openly again across Skyrim. And yet, every step he takes toward that goal potentially strengthens the very enemy he believes himself to be fighting against. His authenticity becomes, in this reading, precisely what makes him such an effective tool. A cynical operative working consciously for Thalmor interests could be discovered, exposed, and discredited. A true believer who has no idea he's being used cannot be undermined in the same way, because there's no deception for anyone to uncover. Ulfric isn't lying to his followers. He genuinely believes everything he says, which makes him, from a purely strategic Thalmor perspective, the perfect instrument. There's an additional dimension worth considering here, one that speaks to the chilling efficiency of this strategy, if the interpretation holds. A Thalmor agent operating openly within Stormcloak ranks could eventually be discovered through ordinary intelligence work, exposed through documents, testimony, or simple suspicion accumulated over time. But a sincere believer requires no agent at all. He requires only the right formative experience at the right moment, a captivity that perhaps revealed just enough about his temperament and his susceptibility to certain ideas, planted with enough subtlety that Ulfric himself would never recognize the planting for what it was. Whether or not this level of calculated cultivation actually occurred, the broader strategic outcome remains the same regardless of intent. A conviction-driven rebellion is, by its very nature, more durable and more difficult to counter than one built on coercion or bribery, precisely because true believers cannot be bought off or threatened into abandoning a cause they hold as sacred. There's an instructive parallel worth drawing here to the Penitus Oculatus, the Empire's own internal security service, distinct from both the Imperial Legion and the Thalmor, whose agents you encounter most directly when they arrive to apprehend Astrid and dismantle the Dark Brotherhood sanctuary. The Penitus Oculatus exists, at least nominally, to protect the Empire and its citizens from threats both foreign and domestic, including threats posed by overreaching Thalmor influence. And yet, based on what their actions throughout Skyrim demonstrate, their cooperation with Thalmor demands regarding Talos worship enforcement reveals an uncomfortable truth about how thoroughly Dominion influence has embedded itself within Imperial institutions that were originally meant to safeguard Imperial sovereignty rather than enforce a rival power's religious agenda. This isn't a minor bureaucratic detail. It illustrates, in miniature, the same dynamic playing out at the level of Ulfric's entire rebellion. Institutions and individuals alike, each believing themselves to be serving the Empire's own interests, unknowingly advancing Thalmor goals because the architecture of compromise built into the Concordat ensures that Imperial self-preservation and Dominion strategic advantage have become, in practice, nearly indistinguishable from one another. This thread also recontextualizes General Tullius's urgency in crushing the rebellion quickly, an urgency that sometimes reads, on the surface, as simple imperial authoritarianism, but that takes on a different shape once you consider what Tullius likely understands, even if only partially, about the broader strategic picture. If Tullius recognizes, even without full documentation, that a prolonged civil war within Skyrim serves Thalmor interests by weakening the Empire's capacity to resist renewed Dominion aggression, then his insistence on swift, decisive military action against the Stormcloaks isn't simply about defending bureaucratic authority. It's a desperate attempt to deny the Thalmor the strategic victory that a long, grinding civil war would hand them, regardless of which side ultimately wins militarily. It's important, in examining this thread of lore, to acknowledge what remains genuinely uncertain. The full extent of what Ulfric revealed during his Thalmor captivity is never explicitly confirmed within the game's text. Whether the Thalmor's classification of him as a useful asset represents a deliberate cultivation strategy stretching back to his captivity, or simply an opportunistic recognition of how his authentic rebellion happens to serve their interests after the fact, remains genuinely ambiguous, and reasonable interpretations can land on either side of that question. What's far better supported is the broader strategic logic itself. Regardless of the specific mechanics of how Ulfric came to be classified as he is, the fundamental truth that a divided, war-torn Skyrim serves Thalmor's strategic interests far more than a unified one does is consistent with everything we know about Dominion long-term planning, and it casts a genuinely tragic shadow over the entire Civil War, transforming what might otherwise read as a straightforward conflict between competing Nord and Imperial visions for Skyrim's future into something closer to a slow-motion catastrophe, one where both sides, Stormcloak and Imperial alike, are in some sense fighting a war whose ultimate beneficiary watches patiently from embassies and shadows, content to let Nords bleed Nords while the actual architects of their suffering continue their work undisturbed. Common soldiers, battles, and turning points. Behind the grand ideological arguments, the political maneuvering of Jarls, and the patient strategic calculations of the Thalmor, the Civil War was ultimately fought and decided by ordinary soldiers, men and women who picked up swords and bows and marched into battles that would determine the fate of holds, cities, and ultimately Skyrim's entire political future. Understanding these soldiers and the major battles they fought reveals the human cost beneath the war's larger narrative. The conflict's military reality unfolds across a series of contested holds, with control shifting based on the player's own involvement in the questline, a detail that makes the Civil War somewhat unique among Skyrim's major storylines in how directly your own actions shape its outcome. Whichever side you choose to support, whether marching under the Stormcloak banner from Windhelm or wearing Imperial colours under Tullius's command from Solitude, the campaign unfolds through a series of contested holds, each representing a strategic and symbolic victory that pushes the overall conflict closer to resolution. Among the most significant of these contested territories is Whiterun itself, and the battle for the city, when it eventually comes, illustrates perfectly how the war's broader ideological stakes translate into devastating personal consequences for a hold that spent so long trying to avoid choosing a side at all. Balgruf's eventual forced decision, typically precipitated by demands tied to the Dragon Crisis and the practical military needs of whichever faction seeks to use Whiterun's central position and Dragon's Reach's strategic value, transforms the hold from a neutral bystander into an active battlefield. The siege of Whiterun, when it occurs, brings the war's destruction directly into a city that many players have come to know intimately through the early hours of the main quest line, making the devastation feel personal in a way that abstract discussions of Jarl politics never quite achieve. Watching Stormcloak or Imperial soldiers fight through the same streets, where you once helped Adrian test new armor, or listen to Mikkel's poor attempts at courting Carlotta Valentia, drives home, in a way no amount of political dialogue could, exactly what's actually at stake when the Civil War's ideological arguments translate into real combat. The aftermath of any siege on Whiterun, regardless of which side ultimately prevails, leaves visible scars on the city that linger well beyond the formal end of hostilities. Burned thatch, broken palisades, and a population forced to reckon with the fact that their home became a battlefield over disputes most of them had spent years trying to avoid taking a side on at all. The fight for Markarth carries its own particular weight given the city's history with Ulfric and the broken promise that still colours the rebellion's reputation there. Should Stormcloak forces eventually move against the city, the battle becomes a kind of bitter homecoming. Ulfric's soldiers returning to retake a city their leader once helped liberate from forsworn occupation, only this time fighting against Imperial forces and the economic power of the Silverblood family, rather than against Reach insurgents. The presence of the Sidna mine and its complicated relationship with Madonach's imprisoned forsworn loyalists adds another layer of tension to any Markarth campaign, given the possibility that renewed conflict in the city could destabilize the careful, if exploitative, arrangement that's kept overt, forsworn violence somewhat contained for years. It's worth dwelling too on the specific ambush that opens the game itself, because it represents one of the war's clearest illustrations of how vulnerable even its most central figure could be to ordinary battlefield misfortune. Ulfric was travelling near the border, accompanied by a relatively small company of soldiers, when Imperial forces sprang a successful ambush at Darkwater Crossing, capturing him along with the future Dragonborn, who happened to be swept up in the same engagement entirely by chance. This detail is worth sitting with, because it reveals just how precarious the rebellion's fortunes truly were at that stage of the war. Ulfric wasn't moving with the kind of overwhelming protection you might expect for a man who represented the entire ideological and military centre of gravity for the Stormcloak cause. He was travelling, by most accounts, toward a meeting tied to the moot itself, the same formal process that would eventually need to recognise him as High King. And it was on that very road, pursuing the legitimacy he'd spent years fighting for, that the Empire nearly ended his rebellion in a single, almost accidental stroke of tactical success. Solitude, as the seat of Imperial power in Skyrim and the location of Castle Dour, represents the war's ultimate strategic prize from a Stormcloak perspective, and the eventual battle for the city, should the rebellion succeed in pushing that far, carries enormous symbolic weight. Taking Solitude doesn't just mean defeating Imperial forces militarily. It means toppling the literal seat of Imperial authority in Skyrim, the same city where Torygg died and where Elisif has spent years trying to hold together a grieving, divided province. The Battle of Solitude, in any Stormcloak victory scenario, represents the war's culminating moment, the point at which Ulfric's rebellion transforms from insurgency into the new established order of Skyrim. Windhelm, naturally, occupies the inverse position in any Imperial victory scenario, representing the final stronghold that must fall for Tullius's forces to claim total victory over the rebellion. The Siege of Windhelm, when undertaken from the Imperial side, carries its own grim symbolism. Imperial soldiers fighting their way into the same palace of the kings where Ulfric once planned his entire campaign, the ancestral seat of Nord tradition falling to the very empire whose accommodation with Thalmor demands originally sparked the rebellion in the first place. Beyond the named soldiers and officers who direct these campaigns, quartermaster positions and the common rank-and-file soldiers you'll fight alongside throughout the Civil War questline deserve recognition as well. Even though most remain nameless throughout your involvement in the conflict, these are the men and women who actually bear the physical cost of the ideological and political arguments we've spent tonight examining. Many of them, on both sides, are ordinary Nords who joined out of genuine conviction about Talos worship or imperial stability, while others, based on what we can observe from incidental dialogue exchanged before and after battles, joined simply because their Hold's Jarl declared an allegiance and conscription or social pressure left them with limited practical choice in the matter. The Civil War, for these common soldiers, often becomes less about grand ideological commitment and more about simple survival. Loyalty to the specific comrades fighting alongside them, and the hope that whichever side they've found themselves fighting for will eventually bring enough stability to let them return to whatever life they left behind before the war began. It's worth pausing on the texture of this experience a little longer, because the game's environmental storytelling offers more detail here than a casual playthrough might reveal. Listen closely to the chatter exchanged between soldiers at Stormcloak and Imperial camps before a battle begins, and you'll hear the small human concerns that persist beneath the war's grand narrative. Worries about family back home, complaints about rations, quiet grief over comrades lost in earlier engagements, even occasional dark humor about the absurdity of fighting countrymen over a treaty most of the soldiers never read, and a religious ban. Most of them resent regardless of which banner they happen to march under. These details matter because they puncture the temptation to view the Civil War purely through the lens of its named leaders and its grand ideological stakes. The war's actual daily texture, for the vast majority of people living through it, was one of cold marches, uncertain supply lines, and the constant low-grade dread of facing an enemy who in many cases spoke the same dialect, prayed to the same hidden shrines, and grew up hearing the same legends of Isgramor and the ancient Draugr kings that every Nord child learns, regardless of which side of the war their family eventually found themselves on. It's worth noting the actual mechanics of how these campaigns unfold in practice, because the structure reveals something true about the texture of medieval-style siege warfare that Skyrim recreates with surprising care. Before any assault on a contested hold, you'll typically need to consult with a quartermaster to assess troop readiness and supply lines, a detail that grounds the war's grand strategy in the unglamorous logistics of feeding, arming, and transporting soldiers across Skyrim's harsh terrain. Securing a hold often isn't simply a matter of marching an army to its gates. It requires first weakening the opposing side's capacity to resist, whether through smaller skirmishes that whittle down defending forces, the capture of supporting territory that cuts off reinforcement and supply, or diplomatic and economic pressure applied well before the first sword is ever drawn in open battle. This layered approach mirrors how real sieges have always functioned throughout history, less a single dramatic clash and more a slow, grinding process of attrition, where the actual fighting often represents only the final, visible stage of a contest that's already been substantially decided by supply, positioning, and morale long before either side's banners meet on the field. The turning points of the Civil War, in any given playthrough, often hinge less on dramatic single battles and more on the accumulation of contested hold-shifting allegiance, each victory making the next campaign slightly easier, as resources, manpower, and strategic positioning shift in favor of whichever faction the player has chosen to support. This structure reflects something true about how civil wars actually unfold in any context. They rarely resolve through single decisive battles, but rather through a gradual accumulation of territorial control, economic strangulation, and the slow exhaustion of the losing side's capacity to continue resisting. It's worth noting too that regardless of which side ultimately wins, the human cost depicted throughout the Civil War questline resists any simple narrative of heroic triumph. Soldiers die on both sides in every battle, regardless of the player's success in achieving victory, and the game's environmental storytelling, scattered corpses, abandoned camps, the grim aftermath of contested holds consistently reinforces the idea that this is a tragedy being fought by people who, in many cases, share more in common with their enemies than the war's ideological framing would suggest. A Stormcloak soldier and an Imperial legionnaire facing each other across a battlefield are very often both Nords, both raised on the same stories of Isgramor and the Dragon War, both shaped by the same harsh Skyrim winters and the same cultural traditions that the war itself claims to be fought over preserving or reforming. This is perhaps the Civil War's deepest and most quietly devastating truth, that the conflict, for all its grand political and religious justification, often comes down to Nords killing Nords, brothers in culture if not in blood, over a wound that traces back not to anything either side actually controls, but to a treaty signed in a distant city under duress by an empire trying desperately to survive an enemy that both Stormcloaks and Imperials, in their own ways, are still fighting today. The war's end and a divided Skyrim's future. Every civil war must eventually end, and Skyrim's is no different, though the manner of its ending depends entirely on which side ultimately claims victory. A victory shaped directly by the choices made throughout the conflict by Imperial and Stormcloak commanders alike, and by the Dragonborn, whose intervention proves decisive in either outcome. Should the Imperial Legion emerge victorious, the war's conclusion typically culminates in the final assault on Windhelm, the rebellion's heart and the ancestral seat of Ulfric's power. The fall of the Palace of the Kings represents not just a military defeat, but a symbolic ending to the dream of an independent, Talos-worshipping Skyrim that Ulfric spent years building toward. In this outcome, Ulfric himself faces execution, his death echoing the fate he himself once narrowly escaped at Helgen, only this time without a dragon's intervention to grant him a reprieve. General Tullius's victory restores, at least nominally, the pre-war status quo, with Imperial authority reasserted across all 9 holds and the White Gold Concordate's restrictions, including the ban on open Talos worship, remaining technically in force, even if private worship inevitably continues in homes and hidden shrines regardless of official policy. This outcome, however, carries its own bitter complications that prevent it from reading as a simple, clean restoration of order. The underlying grievances that drove Nords to rally behind Ulfric in the first place, the humiliation of the Concordate, the suppression of Talos worship, the resentment toward Thalmor presence within Skyrim cities, none of these grievances actually disappear simply because the rebellion has been militarily crushed. An Imperial victory, in this sense, represents less a resolution to the underlying tensions that caused the war, and more a temporary suppression of them, one that risks simply delaying rather than preventing future conflict, particularly given the continued presence of Thalmor agents like Ondolimar, who will undoubtedly continue their work of monitoring and suppressing Talos worship, regardless of which Imperial administration holds nominal authority over Skyrim. Elisif's position, freed from the immediate military threat posed by the Stormcloaks, nonetheless remains constrained by the same web of advisors and competing interests that have shaped her rule since Torygg's death. And an imperial victory does little to address the deeper question of whether she possesses the political skill to actually govern Skyrim effectively in the long term, rather than simply surviving as a sympathetic but ultimately overwhelmed figurehead. Should the Stormcloaks instead emerge victorious, the war's conclusion centers on the fall of Solitude, the symbolic and literal heart of imperial power within Skyrim. Castle Dour falling to Stormcloak forces represents the culmination of everything Ulfric has fought for since his return from Windhelm following Torygg's death, and General Tullius's defeat, whether through death or surrender, marks the end of organized imperial resistance within the province. In this outcome, Ulfric Stormcloak typically ascends to the position of High King, the very outcome his duel with Torygg was originally meant to achieve, and Talos worship is restored to open, legal practice throughout Skyrim, undoing the central religious grievance that animated the entire rebellion from its earliest days. The fall of Solitude also brings the war full circle back to Elisif, the widow whose husband's death started this entire conflict in the first place. In this outcome, her fate rests directly in the hands of whoever leads the final assault, with the choice to spare or execute her left open. Sparing her, an option many players choose given her own sympathetic grief and her general lack of direct culpability in the war's atrocities, leaves her alive but stripped of any real authority. A final, quiet irony for a woman who never wanted power in the first place and who now survives the war that began with her husband's killing, only to watch the man who killed him claim the throne Torygg once held. It's a fittingly bittersweet close to her arc, one that underscores just how little control she ever had over the forces that shaped her life from the moment Ulfric's shout first struck down her husband in that fateful duel. It's worth circling back, here at the war's conclusion, to the moot we discussed earlier, because Ulfric's coronation in this outcome is the moment that long-delayed formal process finally arrives at its destination. The Jarls who survived the war, and who now answer to Stormcloak authority, whether through genuine conviction or simple necessity, gather to confirm what the duel in Solitude first asserted years earlier, that Ulfric possesses the strength and the right to rule. In this light, the entire war becomes legible as the bloody, exhaustive process of assembling that moot vote by force, rather than by persuasion alone. A coronation purchased one contested hold at a time, rather than granted freely. Yet a Stormcloak victory carries its own deeply uncomfortable implications, ones we've spent considerable time exploring tonight through the lens of Thalmor's strategic interest. If the interpretation holds that Ulfric's rebellion, however sincere, ultimately serves Dominion goals by weakening imperial unity and capacity within one of its most strategically important provinces, then a Stormcloak victory represents not a triumph of Nord self-determination, but potentially the completion of a strategy the Thalmor set in motion decades earlier during Ulfric's original captivity. An independent or quasi-independent Skyrim, under Ulfric's rule, having just fought a brutal civil war that depleted its military strength and divided its population along lines that will likely take generations to fully heal, finds itself in a far weaker position to resist any future Thalmor aggression than a unified, imperial-aligned Skyrim might have been. The bitter irony, should this interpretation hold true, is that Ulfric's life's work, the restoration of Talos worship and Nord independence that he believed himself to be fighting for since his humiliating captivity at Thalmor hands, may end up serving the very enemy responsible for that humiliation in the first place. Beyond these two broad outcomes, the war's conclusion reshapes Skyrim's political landscape in ways that ripple through every hold we discussed earlier. Jarls who chose wisely, or who simply happened to align with the winning side regardless of their original motivations, find their positions secured and often strengthened. Those who chose the losing side, or who attempted neutrality for too long like Balgruuf, face the difficult task of either swearing new allegiance to a victorious faction they may have actively opposed, or facing replacement by Jarls more amenable to the new political order. The economic relationships that shaped wartime allegiance, the Silverblood family's influence over Markarth, Maven Blackbriar's control over Riften, continue to operate regardless of which side wins, a detail that underscores how much of the Civil War's actual political reality exists beneath and beyond the ideological framing of Nord pride versus imperial stability that Ulfric and Tullius each invoke. Perhaps most importantly, regardless of which side wins, the war's resolution does little to address the deeper structural tensions that produced the conflict in the first place. The Thalmor remain a looming presence in Tamriel's broader politics regardless of who governs Skyrim. Their long-term strategic patience undisturbed by the outcome of a civil war whose entire purpose, if our earlier interpretation holds true, was simply to weaken whichever side eventually claims nominal victory. The cultural and religious tensions between Nord traditionalism and the multicultural reality of Skyrim's actual population, the uneasy relationship between Windhelm and its Dunmer residents, the prejudice various non-Nord races face throughout the province, regardless of which faction holds power. None of these deeper social fractures resolve simply because one army has defeated another on the battlefield. What the Civil War ultimately teaches then, walking back through everything we've covered tonight, from the humiliation of the White Gold Concordat to Ulfric's captivity and the broken promise of Markarth, from the controversial duel that killed a High King to the patient, hidden strategic calculations of the Thalmor watching from their embassy, is that Skyrim's fracture was never simply a matter of choosing the right side in a clean ideological contest between freedom and stability. It was the slow, inevitable consequence of an old wound left to fester for decades, a wound that both Ulfric Stormcloak and General Tullius, in their own sincere and very different ways, spent the entire war trying to heal, even as their efforts to do so, regardless of who ultimately won, may have only deepened the very vulnerability that made the wound possible in the first place. There's a quiet, almost meditative truth that settles over Skyrim once the dust of the Civil War finally clears, regardless of which banner now flies over Solitude or Windhelm. Walk through any hold in the war's aftermath, and you'll find that the land itself remembers far longer than its politics do. The frozen roads between Whiterun and the Reach still carry the scars of skirmishes fought over territory that changes hands so many times throughout the conflict that few soldiers on either side can recall who held it last. The taverns where bards once sang openly of Ulfric's deeds, or quietly avoided the subject depending on which way the political wind blew in a given hold, eventually settle back into something resembling ordinary life, though the songs themselves never quite forget what was lost. Families divided by allegiance, brothers who marched under different banners, mothers who buried sons regardless of which side those sons fought for, carry grief that outlasts whatever peace treaty or coronation eventually brings the fighting to its official close. Perhaps this is the most honest way to understand the Civil War's true legacy. It was never simply a contest to be won or lost, however much the game's own questline structure necessarily frames it that way for the sake of giving the Dragonborn a clear path forward. It was a reckoning, decades in the making, between an old world of Nord tradition and divine kingship through combat, and a new world of imperial bureaucracy, distant treaties, and the quiet, patient maneuvering of an elven empire that understood, perhaps better than either Ulfric or Tullius ever did, that the deepest victories are the ones nobody has to actually fight for. Whatever Skyrim becomes in the years following the war's resolution, it carries this history forward, etched into its barrows and battlefields and broken promises, a province forever shaped by the long shadow of a treaty signed far from its borders, a duel fought in grief and conviction, and a god's name that an entire people fought, bled, and died simply for the right to speak aloud.